Okay, so I think we should get started. Room's pretty full. So, welcome to Dynamite Data Visualization with Power View in Microsoft Excel. Thank you all very much for coming. This is the official deep dive session for Power View. So, if you're interested in Power View at all, what you can do with it, what's new in the latest release, how it works, why the way it works, why it exhibits the behavior that you see, anything like that, hopefully you will get a lot out of this session. My name is Ricardo Muti. I'm a senior program manager on the SQL Server Business Intelligence team at Microsoft headquarters in Redmond. Specifically, within that fairly large team, I work on what you could call the Power View team. I've been with that team for about 3 years, and a large portion of those 3 years I've spent working on Power View, on the initial release, on subsequent releases, and I spent a lot of time working on a number of the features that we're going to see today. What I thought we would do today is we would start off by giving you a good, solid foundation in what Power View is. I promise you that later in the session, we're definitely going to be demoing a lot and going deep into all the different features and visualizations that you have in Power View, but I don't just want to throw you into that. In this session, I want to make sure that you really understand what Power View is, how it's a little bit different from some other tools that exist in our stack and that we built in the past, and kind of the core tenets of Power View. Next, what's new? So we initially shipped Power View as part of SQL Server 2012, about, I guess, a year and a bit ago now. And we followed that up quite quickly about 6 months later with a service pack. And unusual for most service packs, it wasn't just fixes and it wasn't just quality improvements, but we actually added a bunch of new features. We also had that coincide with the Office 2013 release, and we integrated everything into Excel because Power View was not originally integrated into Excel. Which leads me to my next point, which is Power View was built as this standalone thing, this standalone web application in SharePoint, and then it was only later that we integrated it into Excel. So, and that's not just integrating it into a different shell, it has pretty major implications for what that means. What exactly is it that you're building? What are some of the functionality differences? So we'll talk about what it means to have Power View built into Excel desktop, and also, what happens when you publish that to SharePoint now, those workbooks. How does that work in Excel services, for example? And then we'll get into the demo-heavy portion, and we'll create some Power View reports. We'll create lots of cool Power View visualizations. I'll explain why things are working the way they're working and how you can get things to work that way as we go along the way. Show a lot of different visuals. Maybe you might get some tips and tricks out of it as well. And yeah, in the course of creating those reports, you'll get not only a flavor for what is it like to create Power View sheets in Excel, but you'll get a pretty good overview of a lot of the features that exist in the product, probably with a little bit more emphasis on the ones that we've added in the Office 2013 release. So if that sounds good, we'll get started. Starting with the official definition of what is Power View. This is kind of the official answer. It is an experience for interactive data exploration, visualization on the screen with different types of visuals like charts and tables and maps and KPIs and that sort of thing. And then an experience for you to share and present that with others, with your team, on a projector, in a meeting, that sort of thing. Going into a little bit more detail. Power View is not something that really stands by itself. It is something that is part of our vision that we've been executing on for the last few years, which is Managed Self-Service BI, which is kind of a departure, or at least something that can be contrasted with what our team did in the past, maybe 10 years ago, for example. The team that built Power View was the same team that built reporting services. So if you're familiar with reporting services, and if you're familiar with its history, you might even remember that the initial release of reporting services, the only way that you could create a report was in Visual Studio. The only authoring environment we had was Report Designer in Visual Studio, which made sense at the time because our target audience was developers. It was BI developers. So the market has kind of changed. Things have kind of changed, and we realized that we needed to address the needs for non-developers, for less technically savvy users, to do their own BI. We first tried to do that with Report Builder back in 2005. We called it ad hoc reporting, that users could create their own reports. We then shipped Report Builder 2.0 and 3.0 in later versions. And Report Builder definitely does have this nice Office-like look and feel, and it's definitely less intimidating than Visual Studio if you don't need source control and all the things that you get with Visual Studio. But it's still kind of got a learning curve that is beyond your typical information worker. They often need to know how to create connection strings, how to use a SQL query builder, how to have they need a deep understanding of what grouping and aggregation, these different concepts mean, and how to create fairly complex table structures. So it still didn't quite get as far as we wanted to go. We really want to get to the point where end users, your typical information worker, can go, easily discover some data that's been either curated in their enterprise or something that they found themselves, and then with a few clicks, just start getting basic charts and basic visualizations on the canvas and just exploring the data and hopefully getting answers to their questions. Now, if you ask, why are we doing this? Why does the target audience need to change? Because if you think about the way BI has traditionally been done, business has all this demand for information. They need answers to their questions. And what do? How do they get those answers? They're dependent on IT. They go to IT and say, I need this report, or I need this dashboard. And all these demands from the business are coming on IT to go and create all these artifacts. And the volume of those demands has been increasing at just an incredible rate over the last few years and over the last decade or so. And the increase in capacity in IT departments is not even coming close to that. So IT departments today are largely incapable of keeping up and satisfying with all these demands. And it's certainly not getting any better. It's only getting worse. So today they're largely incapable of satisfying the demands of the business. It's only going to get worse tomorrow. So the only solution to this problem, really, is to somehow put BI in the hands of more users. It doesn't mean that you take IT out of the picture. It just means that it would be great if your average information worker and your average business user could do kind of the 80–90% of things that they need to do. So if they can get 80–90% of the answers they need to get to do their jobs, that is a huge leap forward in BI. Where does that leave IT? You still always need IT for that 10 or 20%. I mean, at some point, it becomes kind of asymptotic that you'll never have everything so easy within a couple of clicks that you don't need experts anymore. You'll always need experts to do the complex end of that spectrum. Plus, somebody's got to manage all this stuff. Somebody's got to govern it. Somebody's got to oversee it. Making sure that people have access to the data that they should have access to and no more. Making sure that we have enough capacity in terms of system resources and that sort of thing to satisfy demand. But the good part is IT can focus on things that are less kind of mundane, day-to-day, just keeping up with demand, and more investing their time more wisely. They can do that 10 or 20% of more complex projects, and they can focus on governance and focus on oversight. So that's managed self-service BI. Another really important concept with Power View is the visual design experience. What I mean by that is that when you're working with Power View, you're always working with the real data on the canvas. You're seeing what anybody else who opens that report is going to see, which sounds obvious, but it's in contrast to a lot of traditional reporting tools. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. It's metadata driven. Again, this is another contrast to traditional reporting services. In traditional RS, you can connect to a wide variety of different types of data sources using all these different data extensions that we have. You can connect directly to SQL, to Oracle, to XML, whatever. You're connecting directly to the raw data. You could connect to an analysis services cube, of course, but you are by no means forced to. So you can connect directly to these raw data sources. In Power View, we did it differently. We decided to make a big bet on a semantic model. That semantic model being the analysis services BI semantic model. And that may seem more limiting, but I mean, really, the analysis services semantic model in turn can connect to the same wide variety of data sources. And by taking a big bet on this one common semantic model, we have this rich metadata layer. And there's all sorts of higher level business metadata in there that tells us things like, this thing isn't just an integer, it's a latitude, so you can plot it on a map. This field, it's a numeric column, but you should group on it, or you should take the sum of it, or you should take the average of it by default. Things that, so we just more automatically do something that makes sense in Power View. So you'll see a lot of examples of the model metadata impacting the default behavior in Power View. presentation ready all times in the sense that it's great that reporting services gives you fairly pixel perfect control over the exact layout of your table and everything like that. But you often have to spend a good amount of time tweaking it to get it to look like what you want and to get it to look professional enough to share it with others. Whereas with PowerView, like I said, we wanted this experience where with a couple of clicks, you get a nice chart or something on the canvas. But we didn't want you to have to mess around with that when you've got an interesting insight so that it looks professional enough for you to present it to other people. We just wanted to look pretty good by default so that you can go and present it in a meeting or share it with your team. And then a question we get really often is, what does PowerView connect to? And I sort of partially answered that already. It connects to an analysis services BI semantic model. But that takes two forms. It could be what we call the Excel data model, now in Excel 2013. So in Excel 2013, you have the ability to create a nice tabular relational data model inside of a workbook, an Excel workbook. And we can connect to that. The PowerView sheets in an Excel workbook could connect to the model in that same workbook, so everything's nice and contained in that workbook. Or there are other scenarios where you're connecting PowerView visualizations in one workbook to a model that's in another workbook. The other thing we can connect to is a more enterprise scale analysis services database. Because at some point, maybe a workbook isn't appropriate in terms of scale. Maybe it is your company's enterprise model. You would typically do that as a database as opposed to a workbook. Maybe you need partitioning. Maybe you need row-level security. A lot of the modeling capabilities are the same between these two things. They're very symmetric. But some of these more enterprise things, like the partitioning and the row-level security that I mentioned, you can't really do in a workbook, and you have to do them in a database. So these are the two things that PowerView connects to. And they may seem like two very different things, right? A spreadsheet basically in a database. But really, under the covers, they're actually the exact same thing. It's the analysis services tabular model, the BI semantic model. The Excel data model is just a version of that that's local, baked into Excel. The analysis services team wrote it, and you've got a sort of a local analysis services in-memory engine inside of Excel 2013. Another way to really get a good understanding of PowerView is to contrast it with traditional reporting. So specifically, let me give you an example. To contrast it with the authoring experience of building a traditional report. So if you're building a traditional report in, say, Report Builder, you might be familiar with something that looks like this. I mean, reporting services, and traditional reporting tools like reporting services, when you really boil it down, are essentially data-driven document generators. They take in some inputs, they do some processing and some rendering, and they spit out some output. They spit out pages in some sort of document file format. So the exercise of automating that document generation is you, as a report author, build two things. Number one, you build queries that will get you the data that you need to populate that document. And number two, you build a layout template that, when combined with those results, will give you your document. So here, you're building a layout template. This is what you'll see in design view of Report Builder. So you won't see, this isn't what your end user, when you render the report, is going to see. You see this template, and you see the layout structure of the table, and you see these references to fields and expressions and that sort of thing. To actually see what your end user is going to see, you go and run it. You go and preview, and you'll see something like this. And probably it's not going to be done, or it's not going to be perfect the first time you go and preview it. You just want to kind of see where you were. So then you go back to design, and you fix things, and you add things, and you typically do a lot of switching back and forth between these two things. It's something that you won't really see in PowerView. Looking at the broader workflow, I guess, of creating traditional reports and doing traditional reporting, you could argue it looks something like this. You are in design mode in Report Builder or Report Designer or something like that, and you're building your queries, and you're building your layout template, and then you want to see what it looks like. So you switch over and you preview it, and then you'll typically, like I said, have a lot of iterations of these things. At some point, you have something that you think looks good, and you want to publish it. So you now publish that to the report server. And this is where the consumption of traditional reports, that part of the workflow, comes into play. So, and again, I said it's data-driven document generation. You take some inputs. The first input is parameters. So very often, reports will be parameterized, and the user, there will be some defaults, but maybe the user can override them. So they could say, well, I want this report for only this date range or for only this region or something like that. And then the other input is the data. We actually, like I said, connect directly to these different data sources. We run the queries, we get the results, we take a snapshot of that data, and then we run the rest of the processing of the report over that snapshot of data. So the next step, yes, to put it to the reporting services engine, the processing and rendering engine, which processes all of the expressions and calculations and things in the report. It does a pagination pass. We have pagination modules. It's very, very page-based sort of design. And then we have renderers that will render these pages to different output formats like PDF or Word or HTML or what have you. And at the end, you get a document with some of the pages. And then this is a sort of an interactive view of this where the user is actually going to the browser and saying, run this report with these parameters. But there's also the unattended scenario where you're wrapping this in scheduling and delivery. So scheduling, you have a subscription that fires on some schedule. And then you have a delivery extension where you deliver the result by email usually, or it could be file share, it could be SharePoint. But that's basically the workflow of traditional reporting. If you contrast that with Power View, it looks quite different. With Power View, you're not necessarily trying to automate the generation of documents. It all starts with you have a business question. You need some information. You need an answer to a question. You want to hypothesize about something and want to see if the answer is in your data. So you have your raw data. So how can we get the answer? The first step is to import that into the data model. Now, there are a few different scenarios for doing this and a few different people who might be doing it. On the one hand, it could be that your company, like I said, has an enterprise semantic model, an enterprise business model, and they've already done this part. And then you're simply picking it up from here. You don't even know about the data sources behind this, but you as an information worker are simply connecting to that well-known curated model and then exploring the data in there. But it could also be that you're doing something, some of your own kind of off the beaten path exploration, and you found some other data, or you just want to maybe look at some external data out there from Windows Azure Marketplace or something like that and see if there's a correlation between interesting things. You're doing your own kind of investigative BI. And so you could pull that into the data model and use Power Pivot and Excel and do your own modeling. And then there's even a lighter weight, kind of more implicit version of that, where if you just take some data, you paste it into an Excel sheet, and then you create a Power View report off that, you may not know it, but you've actually created a data model under the scenes. So somehow you get some data model. And then you start creating Power View sheets on top of that, and you explore the data in that data model, and you interact with it on the screen. You create interesting visualizations. And then maybe you find some interesting insights, some interesting answers to your questions. And you may want to share this with other people now. So the final step of this workflow is you maybe share it with your team on SharePoint. You send them a link, say, hey, check this out. Or you have a meeting like this where we're presenting it on the screen. But that's basically the workflow of Power View. Whether this thing becomes a long-lasting artifact that you have in SharePoint and people look at it every day, or maybe one day we want to schedule it somehow, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The purpose of this slide seems to be that somebody wanted a gratuitous PowerPoint animation, so there you go. The point is, I guess, that we first shipped Power View in SQL Server 2012. There are a lot of features in there, and yet there's a lot more that we wanted to do. But there's already a lot of functionality in SQL Server 2012. But what's more interesting and more recent developments, I guess, is the investment that we did in SP1. And like I said, this is unusual for us because service packs are usually just that. They're just service packs. But this is a special service pack that aligns with the Office 2013 release. So our team wanted to integrate this into Office. We did that in addition to adding a bunch of new functionality. So I could just give you the laundry list of that functionality, but there are some themes here. So one of them is closing the gap to model features. So the way the roadmap worked was we built Power Pivot, and we built that modeling layer that I told you about inside of Excel, actually before SQL Server 2012. We built it back in SQL Server 2008 R2. We only built Power View for SQL Server 2012. So we were kind of a step ahead on the modeling side or a step behind on the data visualization side in terms of schedule. So we couldn't squeeze support for every model feature in Power View in the first release. We had some gaps. We really wanted to not have those gaps. It was unfortunate, but we had them. So for example, you could have hierarchies or KPIs in the model. You wouldn't see them in Power View. We couldn't support them in Power View. If you had hyperlinks in your model, you could not render those in Power View as hyperlinks. So I'm happy to say that we closed all those gaps. Another one is style and formatting. So Power View, like I said, doesn't give you quite the pixel-perfect control over style that you have in classic reporting services. To some degree, that's by design in the sense that we just want nice-looking things by default. But we do want to give you control where we think it's important to give you control. And you had very little of that in Power View in SQL Server 2012 RTM. You had a very, very small number of basic themes, which were basically color themes, palettes. You couldn't have different background colors for your slide, for example. You couldn't put background images. You couldn't put a corporate logo in your report. You really didn't have much control over the size of text in your report. So we've addressed a lot of those things in SQL Server 2012 SP1. So you have 40 themes that are symmetric with the themes in Office, similar to the themes that you have for PowerPoint slides. And you can apply any of those themes. You have nice background colors. You can do background images. You can put your corporate logo in the top left of the slide, and so on. You can also include hyperlinks in your report, which is really useful. It could be just a static hyperlink, or it could be something that's showing up in a table, repeating bound to data. And then the possibilities are endless with a hyperlink. You can click on that, and it can go anywhere. And then the big obvious one is, whenever we're doing new releases of Power View, we want to expand the visualization and interactivity capabilities of the product. So one really, really useful thing that we added was maps. So we integrated with Bing Maps. So you have nice interactive maps that you can plot data points on in Power View. Pie charts. Pie charts is one of the most controversial data visualizations. If you ask any data visualization expert, or if you want to see data visualization experts just start a long flame war about something, just go search for some blog posts on pie charts. The thing is, they are, in truth, one of the most misused visualizations. A lot of times you'll see a pie chart used, and it's really not the easiest way to visualize and compare values. You would have been better off with a column chart or something like that. But we like to be pragmatic, and we think that there are reasonable, effective uses of pie charts. So probably to some people's dismay, we did add pie charts in this release. And then another one, which I really like, is drill down. I think it adds a lot of power to the product, where you can have multiple levels of detail, and you can be looking at something in a chart or table at one level of detail, and then drill in further and further, and really get to the root of the insight you're looking for. So these are all features that we added, but there's one big additional thing we added, which is the focus of this session, which is we integrated the whole thing into Excel. And this really helps us tell our Microsoft BI story better, because this is what we've been saying Microsoft BI is for years. We've been saying it's the industry-leading tools in their categories, the industry-leading Office productivity suite, portal and intranet software, and relational database management system, and data platform. Excel, SharePoint, and SQL Server. Tools that a lot of customers already have, they're already using. Users are certainly familiar with them. It just makes sense to build RBI into these tools. And yet, when we ship Power View in SQL Server 2012, you could ask the obvious question, why doesn't it show up in Excel if we're claiming that Excel is our client, our one-stop client BI tool? So now we no longer have to dance around that question anymore. We built it into Excel. Excel is, if you take one thing from this session from our BI strategy, it's that this is it. And from a client desktop BI tool perspective, we have one answer to that, and it's Excel. So everything surfaces in Excel, including now Power View. What does it mean for Power View to be integrated into Excel? It means, like I said, more than just Power View is wrapped in a different shell now. The thing that you're creating is different from what it was before. The thing that you created in SQL Server 2012, Power View, we could call it Power View Standalone, the standalone web app inside of SharePoint, was a special purpose file. It was a Power View report, a .rdlx file. All it contained was Power View sheets, because it's a Power View report. It's not a workbook, has nothing to do with Excel. It doesn't contain native Excel sheets or other Excel calculations or anything. It doesn't contain data. It's only the definition of the visualizations. And it doesn't contain a data model. So any sheets in that report are connecting to some data model that's external to that file, some other workbook or some other database. Whereas with Power View and Excel, you're using Excel. You're creating a an Excel workbook. And you can do all the things that you always do in Excel. It's not a special type of workbook or anything like that. You can have traditional Excel sheets. You can have pivot tables. You can have just raw data on the sheets. But you can also have this new type of sheet, which is a Power View sheet. And the workbook can contain a data model, like I said. And the Power View sheets in that workbook could connect to either that data model that's embedded in the same workbook or some other data model in SharePoint or in a database or something. Each sheet in the report must connect to one of those. It can't combine data from multiple ones. But you could have different sheets in the workbook that connect to different things. So you could have some that connect locally and some that connect to an external data model. So we have these different flavors of Power View now, right? We have it surfacing in different places. We have Power View showing up in Excel desktop. We have Power View showing up in Excel in the browser as well, in Excel services or Excel web app. And then we still have the Power View standalone web application that we shipped in SQL Server 2012. There are some differences between the functionality that you have between those different applications. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. You guys will get the slides later. But to call out some important ones, number one, Excel web app currently is a consumption-only experience. You can see your Power View sheets. You can click on them. You can interact with them. But you can't do authoring actions. You can't create brand new visualizations, create brand new sheets. You can't change a chart type or add new fields or something like that. That may change in future, but right now, Excel desktop is where you do your authoring. Another one, like I mentioned, is Power View standalone does not have an embedded data model, so it's always connecting to some data model somewhere else. And then one of the things you're going to hear at this conference is that the older type, the more classic type of analysis services model is not a tabular model, but a multidimensional model, a cube. And Power View originally did not have the ability to connect directly to those because the query language that we speak doesn't work with cubes. But we've closed that gap and just shipped it a matter of days ago. But so far, it's only been shipped for Power View standalone, so you can't connect to those from Excel just yet. Hopefully, again, that's something that Excel will get caught up with that. And then finally, you can export Power View standalone reports to PowerPoint. We don't yet have a PowerPoint integration story for Excel, which is unfortunate because that's one of my favorite features. I worked on that feature myself, and I wish that you could sort of copy and paste things from Excel to PowerPoint, but it's one of the features that we haven't been able to get in quite yet. I hope we have some scenario for that in future. But you can see that there are pros and cons to using Power View in Excel versus using Power View standalone. As for the architecture, here's kind of how it works. Starting with Excel desktop. What do you actually need and what components are involved here? When you're using Power View in Excel, you have a Power View add-in that's shipped inside of the Excel box. It's technically an add-in in terms of the technical architecture, but it's shipped with Excel as part of the Excel license if you have Pro Plus or you have certain Office 365 subscriptions. So there's not some separate thing that you have to install. What that's communicating with is it's communicating with the reporting services server, reporting services engine, that is also built into that add-in and built inside of Excel. So we're not going to any server or anything yet. And then if you have Power View sheets that are querying the embedded data model, you also have analysis services in-memory engine, the Power Pivot engine, the Power Pivot add-in. All that's built into Excel as well. So for querying local data inside of that you've imported into the local data model, it's all local. There's no communication going on with the server here. However, like I said, you can have Power View sheets that go and connect to an external workbook in SharePoint or to an AS database. In that case, you'd be connecting to some database server externally. And then you would have the connectivity requirement for those sheets. For Power View in SharePoint, it's a little bit more complicated because of all the server infrastructure. But you have Power View, what happens when you take these workbooks and then you put them in SharePoint and people click on a workbook in SharePoint, and what happens when you do that? It tries to open it up in Excel services or it tries to open it up in Excel web app. So how do the Power View sheets work in that situation? So you have basically these 4 tiers. You don't necessarily have 4 physical tiers. I mean, it could all be on one box. It can be on 3 different boxes. But these are the 4 possible tiers that you have. So in the browser, you go and you open a workbook in Excel web app or Excel services. That goes and communicates with the web front-end components on in SharePoint for Excel services. That delegates a lot of the real number crunching work to Excel calculation services, which is, if you're familiar with SharePoint architecture, a service application that runs in the SharePoint app server tier. And then for that to go and connect to the embedded data model, what it does is there's actually an instance of analysis services that's installed and configured in a certain mode called Power Pivot mode, which is actually dedicated to just supporting this scenario, just supporting these embedded data models in workbooks in SharePoint. And it's registered with SharePoint. And it's registered with Excel services. So that Excel services knows when you try and access a workbook and it's got an embedded data model and you want to query the data model, it rips the data model out of the workbook and it streams it to this AS instance as a sort of temporary database. And then that's what it's actually going to be querying when you're querying the workbook. If you're querying an external analysis services tabular model, it would already be there. It would not have to be streamed by Excel services or anything. You simply have a connection string that's going to point there. Now, what happens when you open a Power View sheet? When you open a Power View sheet, it's still fundamentally based on reporting services, not Excel services. So what it does is it communicates with the reporting services add-in in SharePoint. The add-in is something that you can install with SQL Server 2012 SP1. It's also a free web download. There's no license required for this component. However, that, like Excel services, delegates a lot of the real number crunching work to a service application that runs on the back end, on the app server tier. And that's reporting services in SharePoint mode. The same thing that supports classic RS reports supports Power View reports as well. So for this, you do need a SQL Server license. So the important tidbit there is that if you want to publish these workbooks to SharePoint and have them work in SharePoint, you need SQL Server BI Edition or SQL Server Enterprise Edition, and you need the licensing for that in the server environment. And then when we go and connect to the embedded data model, we will connect through ADOMD.net, which is the managed data provider for analysis services. And that, under the covers, talks to Excel services. It talks to analysis services. If we're talking to an external data model, it just connects directly to that external data model. One interesting thing to know is that from a reporting services perspective, it's opaque to us. We have no idea what we're connecting to. We simply have an analysis services connection, and we have a connection string that points to somewhere, and then we open up the connection with ADOMD.net. And whether it is a workbook in the same SharePoint farm, in a different SharePoint farm, if it's actually a database and not a workbook, ADOMD and Excel go and figure that all out. Reporting services has no idea. So with that, switch it over to a demo. Okay. It's locked on me. All right, so starting with something really, really basic. Let's say I just have some data on a sheet. How easy, with a regular Excel report, if I had some data on a worksheet, would it be to visualize this with Power View? In this particular case, I've just taken some data from Data Explorer. I'm not going to go really into Data Explorer because it's not the focus of this session, but there's a separate session on Data Explorer which I would highly encourage you to go and check out because it's a really cool tool for finding data discovery. So here I've searched for some data and found data on the biggest employers in New Orleans. And so here we have that list. It ended up having been imported as from Data Explorer as just some data on my sheet, regular Excel table. All I have to do is I go up here to Insert, and I have this new option for Power View. See that there? I'll just click on Power View. And now what's going to happen is it's going to load the Power View add-in for Excel, which is built into the box. Just give this a minute. And there we go. We see the same data on the Power View canvas. So to take stock of what we have here, this is what Power View looks like inside of Excel. You can see that it's just a different type of sheet. We've got this main canvas area where we can create visualizations. We've got this filters area where we can create filters. And then you've got your typical field list and field well. If you're familiar with pivot tables or pivot charts, that will probably look very familiar. So here there are a couple fields that I don't want, so let me just drag these out of here. And I've got basically employee, employer, and the number of employees. So what if I wanted to look at this as a chart or something? Very easy. I just click column chart up here in the Power View ribbon tab and say, make this a column chart. And there we go. Now we've got a column chart. Very easy. If I want to sort this, maybe I can sort it by set it by the employer alphabetically, by the number of employees, started descending, and there we go. We got the top employers in New Orleans. So that's how easy it is to create Power View reports on top of basic Excel sheet data. Now, let's look at something a little bit more sophisticated. So what I've done in this case, and you'll notice, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention. In this case, if you've used the Power Pivot add-in before to do any modeling or anything like that, I didn't use that in this case. The data model was created for me implicitly under the scenes. This table here is basically the table that's in the data model. If I were to go into Power Pivot, which again is the other add-in that's built into the box, you can go and see what's in the data model. This is the one table that's in the data model. It's your relational model inside of Excel. But I didn't go in here and create it this way. It just created it for me under the scenes. So here, I did something different. I actually used the Power Pivot add-in because I wanted to do some more sophisticated modeling, and I pulled in data from different sources. So what I did was I went to, you can pull from a variety of different sources, the typical ones, SQL Server, analysis services, other relational databases. If you look at this list, you've got basically everything under the sun, Oracle. You always have the out of typical OLADB, ODBC. So anything you can connect to with that, you can pull in the data here. And then you can pull in data from multiple data sources and kind of mash them up in the model. So what I did in my case was actually have good support for data from Windows Azure Marketplace, which if you haven't checked out, by the way, I would check that out as well. It's a marketplace where they have all sorts of cool apps, but they also have a bunch of data sets, both free data sets and ones that you can pay for. And there was one from one of our partners that they were a medical research company, and they published a bunch of their medical research data, which I thought was interesting. And also pulled in some of my own data. Just, I needed data on different regions of the United States, census regions and that sort of thing. Some other medical kind of lookup data. I got a lot of that from Wikipedia, just pulled it in here, just typed it into Excel and synced it in here, and then created a mashup by linking these things together. And so here I've got all my different tables. You can see all of these different tables of data. And again, if you go over to the diagram view, then it really becomes apparent that we're not just creating spreadsheets and spreadsheet tables anymore. We're creating a proper relational model here inside of the workbook. So anyway, I've got this medical research data. So let's start interacting with it with Power View. So I'll click Power View here. I'll give this a sec. So now what's showing up here is that semantic model. It's a view of that model, the tables and the columns in that model. And to get started, I can actually, well, look at that. If I hover over some of these tables, I can actually get some metadata already. So here there's a table called chart. I wouldn't have known what that means, but by hovering over it, I get a description that the modeler put it in that says it contains patient charts, medical charts. This is all the vitals that the doctors collect when somebody goes to the doctor. So let's see what's in there. I can just click on this table, and it's going to add data from that table onto the canvas. Now, if I go and expand this, you'll notice that it selected some fields and not others. And that probably seems kind of arbitrary. Why did it pick these fields? You probably would have expected it to just pick all of them. This is another example of model metadata. So in the model, there's metadata that says if somebody just clicks on this field, on this table rather, this is a sort of nice default set of fields to include rather than including everything. And I'm by no means locked into that. I can remove some of these things. I can add other ones. It's just a starting point. It's just a default. So what do some of these icons mean? You see a lot of different icons in the field list here. You'll see beside chart ID here that you've got this sort of card-looking icon. If I can zoom in on that. Highlighted there. So it's got this card-looking icon. What that means is this column is either a key for the table or it is something that groups on the key for the table. Either of which means by grouping on that, what I'm going to get is I'm going to get a details group. I'm going to get one row for each row in the actual data table. It's the lowest possible level of detail. So to show you an example of what I mean by that, if I were to go to physician specialty here, right? And I click on that. That does not have a details group icon. It does not group on the key. It's not set up to do that. So here, I have a table in my model with something like hundreds of thousands of rows. Here, clearly, I do not have hundreds and thousands of rows. So what do I have? I have the distinct values of this column. So it's grouping by the values in this column, not by the key in the table. I contrast that, if I grab chart ID here, which is the key, and I expand this, I do get one row for each value in the table. And you'll notice it was still pretty quick, even though it's hundreds and thousands of rows, because we never go and get hundreds and thousands of rows. We get something like 100 rows, and then as you scroll, you'll notice we'll go and query more. And it's pretty fast. So that's the difference between details grouping and value grouping. Another icon that you'll see here, if I hover over something like systolic blood pressure here, see that little sigma icon? That means that whenever you have numeric data, and sometimes when I drag it onto the canvas, or I drag it into a visualization, it's kind of inherent where I'm dragging it that I need to either group on the values of that column, or I need to aggregate them somehow. I need to sum them up or average them up or something like that. So for example, if I'm taking this and I'm putting it on the category axis of a chart, it means I need to group on it. I need to get all the values of it. If I'm putting it on the value axis of a chart, it means that's what I'm measuring. I need to sum it up or average it or somehow. Sometimes it'll be ambiguous. If I just take this and I put it into a table, I could group on it or I could sum it up. So which one should we bias towards? If you see that sigma icon, it means we bias towards aggregating it, not grouping on it. So again, to show you the difference, right? Let's say I go to, I got regions of the United States here. I'll grab a region name. And let's make the text a little bit bigger here too. Let's grab a region name, and then we'll also grab that blood pressure field. Again, there are hundreds and thousands of distinct values of this blood pressure metric, right? Clearly, I'm not getting all of them. I'm just summarizing them. And the summarization that it chose was average. How did it know to do average? I'm going to repeat myself and sound like a broken record in this presentation, but it's model metadata. The model says it doesn't make sense to sum up people's blood pressure. That makes no sense. So if you're going to sum it up, if you're going to aggregate it, you should be averaging it. So that's what we want. So here, to show you an example of the opposite, if I grab the region name and I go to patients and I grab age, it's also a numeric column. But you'll notice it is not marked to summarize. It's marked as do not summarize. So if I choose that, I don't get average age or sum of age. I get the individual ages, which is, I did that for a reason in my model, and we'll see why later. But maybe in this case, I do want the average age per region. So you can override that, and you can say, just go to the field list over here and choose an aggregate function. So I'm going to say, in this case, I want to average these. Now, it looks like the modeler, who is me in this case, did not bother to format these nicely in terms of the numbers. So I can do that in Power View as well. I can say, make this a number, and maybe I want just one decimal place, and there you go. That looks a little bit nicer. So let's look at creating maybe a more, got a basic understanding of some of these different fields. By the way, some ones that you don't see here, sometimes you'll see fields or fields with a calculator icon on them. Those are essentially not columns in the table at all. They are what they call calculated fields or measures. They're basically just formulas in the Excel model. You can't group on them. You can only just evaluate the calculation within a particular context. And then you've got a variant of those, which are these traffic light icons, which are KPIs. So there's some formula, but you also have business metadata that tells you what's good, what's bad, what's the goal, what's red, yellow, green, and so on. We'll see that a little bit later as well. So let me delete these, and let's create a more sophisticated table. So here, maybe let's grab some geographic information. Here you see an example of a hierarchy. You can see that I've got this location hierarchy, and then it's got two levels, region and division. So I can actually just check that location, and by default, it'll check the two levels within the hierarchy. After that, there's really nothing special about a hierarchy. It would be just like adding those two columns directly. So a hierarchy is just a convenience feature, really. In this case, that's not exactly what I want. I actually want region and state. Notice that state shows up with this globe icon because it was recognized automatically by the model as a name of US states as geographic data. So I'll choose that. And then let's maybe count up the number of visits to the hospital for each of these regions and states. So I can go up here to chart. And the nice thing about this is that I don't have to necessarily explicitly include a calculation in my model that counts the number of rows, that counts the number of charts. I can simply take any field like this and go and say add it as a count. Don't add the individual values, just add the count of the values as a calculation. Now, to some people, this is what they expect. This is sort of the layout structure that they expect. But some other people, it's unexpected to them. Why is Midwest repeating like this? They want some sort of blocked kind of hierarchical structure. The reason is this is a table in PowerView terminology, and a table is simply that. It's just a flat table. It's like a spreadsheet. There's no hierarchy to it or anything like that. You'll notice over in the field well here, by the way, that there's only one field well bucket called fields. There's no rows or columns or like different regions of this table. It's not like a pivot table. However, I can get something that's more like a pivot table by converting this to a matrix. And now you'll have, if you look over here, different regions in the field well. Row groups, column groups, and the values, which are the intersections between them. So now you'll see I get one row for Midwest, and then you get these sub-rows. I get subtotals. I can turn the subtotals on or off. So here I can take maybe another thing like visit year. And again, visit year is something that is set to bias to aggregate when it's ambiguous or when it could do either. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take visit year, and I'm going to drag it to columns, which means I want to group on it on the columns. And now I'm going to get this. I'm going to get geography on rows, years on columns, and then the number of visits in the intersection. To do basic filtering, it's really easy. I just go up in the filter icon here, and it will show me filters for that table. And then I can go and say, the data looks pretty sparse before 2008, so maybe just let me clean this up and filter this to 2008 and later. And there you go. That's a basic matrix. So let's do a little bit more interesting analysis here. So let's say that I want to open up a hospital. And I'm curious that if I were to open it up tomorrow, what kind of demographics would I see coming through the front door? Specifically, ages of the people coming in for admissions. Would I see a lot of young people? Would I see a lot of old people? So let's see if we can find the answer to that, and then go from there. So we'll call this hospital admissions. And let's start with age. So we'll go to patients. We'll grab their age. And then let's go up and count those charts again, because that's counting the number of visits. And then, very easily, you'll notice that everything starts by default as a table in PowerView when you add the data, but I can really easily convert it to something else. So I'm going to convert it to a line chart. And there you go. You can see the trend. I don't get a ton of young people. I don't necessarily get a ton of old people, because not everybody lives that old. But we get a lot of middle-aged people. And what's interesting also is you have this huge spike for some reason at age 57. So it would be interesting to see, to drill into that further. Now, what if I want to incorporate additional dimension here? What if I want to split up men and women and see whether the trend is any different between men and women? I can take this gender field here, and I could drag it down to legend or drag it down to multiples or something and say, be very explicit about what I want PowerView to do with it. But one of the things I want you to notice is that PowerView, again, has these intelligent defaults. And I can just click this and say, incorporate this somehow into the data visualization. Figure out the next logical place to put this. And then let's see what it does. So in this case, it's pretty simple. I'm going to add this, and it's just going to add a series for men and women. And it's going to put that, these two lines and put the coding in the legend. So, and there's another insight here, because you can see that big spike at 57 is only for the women, not for the men, for some reason. Alternatively, I mean, if you look at what I have here, I have a field in the legend, gender. And I'm taking the values of those fields and drawing a line for each of those values. The other thing I can do instead is I can plot multiple measures there, multiple different metrics. So instead of plotting just visits, I could also plot how often do these result in a diagnosis. So I can add this to values as well. And now your legend isn't the values of a field. It's different fields, different calculated fields or numeric fields. I can add another one. I can add a third one. Let's add a number of prescriptions as well. Sometimes you get a diagnosis and you get a prescription for it. So there you go. You can see that. Now, what if I wanted to look at this trend across different regions of the United States? I've got the regions here, and I can go and add region name. But what can this possibly do? How can it possibly incorporate this additional field? Because everything seems in use. I have age on the category axis. I've got these measures on the vertical axis. I've got the legend in use already because I've got 3 different measures being plotted. How I'm going to incorporate region. At this point, this is kind of where we're going with modern data visualization and going beyond what you used to be able to do with basic Excel charts. Because at this point in Excel, you'd basically be done. There's nowhere else to put this. But if I choose region name here, it does something pretty cool. It creates what we call small multiples. So you've got an additional axis now, and we've got one chart for each region. And the axes are all synchronized, the scales are all synchronized, so we can compare these things. So, and you get an additional insight there. It's an effective visualization. We can see that chart, that spike, which we realized was age 57, then we realized it was only women, and now we realize it's only women age 57 in the western region of the United States. So, interesting stuff there. Let's create another Power BI report and look at some more visualizations. So here I want to look at different types of diseases that perhaps people are being diagnosed with. So if I go and hover over this disease table, it looks like it's a classification of different types of diseases. Again, I'll just click on it, and I get this default set of fields on the table, on the canvas. And there are some of these fields I'm not really interested in, so let's get those out of here. And you can see I've even got an image in there. The image is embedded in the model in this case. And I would highly encourage you to see whether, when you're creating models, it makes sense to include an image, because it can make the whole experience more fun, but also can help you to easily recognize different things. Imagine you had different company logos of your clients, or flags of different countries, or product logos, or something like that, or product images. So here, this is just a basic table, but when I'm looking, just kind of perusing a list of things like this, another visual that I can choose that is pretty visually appealing is this card visualization. It makes everything a little bit bigger, and it's kind of nice to just scroll through the list of these different things. Now, maybe I want to see not only what these diseases are, but how common are they, which probably some of these are very common, some of them are very rare. So let's go look at diagnosis, and let's count up the number of diagnoses. So now we got the count in there, but at this point we've kind of changed what we're doing, and this is not really the ideal way to compare how frequent or how common these things are. We should probably go back to a chart at this point. So I can go up to bar chart, make this a bar chart, and again in Power View you can pretty freely convert between one visual and another, even if they look nothing alike. Like that's pretty completely different from what we were just looking at. And then I can do sorting, so I can sort not only alphabetically, but again, maybe by the measure value, by the count, and sort it descending. And that way at the top, we have the most common types of different diseases. Now, maybe let's create a little dashboard here. So let's do the number of diagnoses, and let's slice it by age group as well. And then we'll convert that to a column chart. And I'll put this down at the bottom here. So we've got the different age groups and number of diagnoses. You can see as you get older, you have more diagnoses for different conditions. And then let's copy and paste that. We'll create another chart like that, but maybe slice it by something else. Let's look at gender again. Slice this by gender. Oops. Get rid of this. And then maybe let's create a different type of chart for this one. Since there are only 2 values, just want to kind of compare them, the contribution towards the whole. Maybe we'll make that a pie chart. So this is one of the new visuals, the pie chart. And that's what I mean about kind of being pragmatic. I think this is a pretty effective, reasonable use of a pie chart. Just want to see what percentage of the total is men versus women. So actually, let me make these a little bit smaller. Need a little bit more space at the top here. And then what if we could just stick a couple of interesting metrics up in the top there, right? So I'm going to move this title over a bit. And then let's put some health statistics up there. Let's look at maybe blood pressure. And blood pressure isn't one number. You may know that there's an upper number and a lower number. So I'll pick the 2 numbers. And then, yeah, we just have it as a table, but maybe it would be nice if we want these numbers just kind of big in the corner there as a card. And then different from the other card style is another card style called callout, where you want this sort of big KPI, big number sort of look. And I can pick callout, and then we get this. And there we go. We got these numbers big in the corner there. Now, that's nice little dashboard. But the beautiful thing about the semantic model is that we know how everything is interrelated. We know, that there are relationships between these different columns. And in a lot of other tools, you might have to say, well, I want this thing when I click on it to do some other action and hook it up to this other thing. You don't have to do any of that. Everything is going to be automatically interactive. So if I just click on this 18 to 34 age group, it automatically cross-filters other things. It cross-highlights other things. You'll notice that you don't see very much of this highlighted because younger people don't have that many diagnoses for these things. Again, notice that we didn't just add regular old pie charts to the product. We added pie charts that behave the way you expect a Power View visualization to behave. They have this cool radial highlighting look and feel to them. And as we go up through the age groups, you'll see like these metrics are changing. The highlights are changing. You got animations that kind of draw your eyes to some of the differences. There, you might notice that when I went to the 65 and over age group, that this bar really shot up. And that is diseases of the circulatory system. So heart disease and that sort of thing. What about if I look at male versus female? Interestingly, for heart disease, you might think of it as something that affects men more than women, but it's pretty 50-50. If I choose men, if I choose women, it's about the same. Now, I mentioned drill down is a really powerful feature. Here's an example why. Diseases of the circulatory system, it's fairly broad, right? Okay. So people within that's just a categorization of diseases. It's not a specific diagnosis. What if I want to find out what they're being diagnosed with specifically? I could create another totally different visualization maybe to look at that. But what if I just want to drill down in place? What I can do is I can grab the actual specific diagnosis description, drag it also into the axis along with the categorization. And you won't see any effect immediately because we're staying at the current level where we are. But if I drill into it, now we're looking at diseases of the circulatory system. And I can pop this out and make it bigger, by the way. And what are the specific diagnoses that you see at the top? Types of hypertension or high blood pressure. And again, we're still cross-highlighted by women. So you can see that even for hypertension, it's 50-50 between men and women. It's just as common across both. So that's some interesting interactivity and drill down that we can do there. Let's keep going. Let's do some other interesting things. So I talked about visualizations that you can't really do in Excel, more modern visualizations that go beyond what you might be used to. Let's create another one like that. Let's add the diseases again. But this time, I'm going to convert it to this thing called tiles. And what tiles does is it creates a container. It's a container that contains pretty much arbitrary other data visualizations. And here you've got the different types of diseases up in the tab strip of the tile container. And then inside here, I can put almost whatever I want. So let's put, maybe for each disease, I want to look at the trend over age and over gender. So we'll create a similar chart. We'll go age, gender, and we'll count up the number of diagnoses for that disease. And make it a line chart. It's automatically filtered by the thing that's selected above. So when I'm looking here, I'm looking at digestive diseases only. And when I look over here at heart disease, I'm looking at heart disease only. And again, you can see the trend there that pretty equally common between men and women, and certainly much more common once you get into the older half of the age range here. So let's dig a little bit more into this whole blood pressure, heart disease thing, and with some other cool visualizations. So here let's do blood pressure, and what's another factor related to blood pressure? Weight. So what I'm going to do here is let's grab different states, maybe across the US. We can slice it that way. And then let's grab those two metrics. Let's grab blood pressure and weight. And one of the ways to check for a correlation between two values, like blood pressure and weight, a really effective visual for that is with a scatter chart. So you put one on each axis, one on the X, one on the Y, and you see whether you get a sort of diagonal trend. And here you don't get an extremely strong diagonal trend, but you do get some diagonal trend. You can see this going from bottom left to top right. And I can turn a scatter chart into a bubble chart by choosing an additional field. So maybe like here, I will choose just the number of charts. and add it to the size of the bubble. And there you go. You can see, maybe that might even help more to see that there's some degree of diagonal trend there. So maybe I don't want to look by state, though. I was interested in looking by gender. So let's go down to gender and pick that. And maybe I want to look at this over age as well. So I have that age field. Something really cool that I can do with a bubble chart is I can drag age down to play axis. And now I get an animated bubble chart. By the way, this little thing up here that says showing representative sample, you will see something like that sometimes. One thing to understand is basically everything in PowerView, we will either do what we call data segmentation or paging, where we'll get some of the values and then you scroll and we'll get some more. Or we will do basically a hard limit. For a chart, we'll get the top 1,000 values or something like that, and then it'll stop and you'll get a warning saying you're looking at the top 1,000 values. Or in this case, we'll take a representative sample. So for what's tripping it off in this case is we got the play axis, and we can only show up to 60 frames. And there are more than 60 distinct ages. So we picked a fairly equal interval of 60 ages over these 90 ages that we actually have. So what's interesting in this case is that there's almost a contradiction forming here, where we said that blood pressure, high blood pressure afflicts women as much as it does men. And yet here you can see that at least at age 19, women have a blood pressure that's at least 10 points lower than men. So those seem to contradict each other. But if you play this out over time, you can maybe get the answer to that question. So I can add marker traces on top of these things so that when you play them, I can see the history of where they've been. You could see that weight and blood pressure increase for both as you age. But then what's interesting is the men start to slow down. They don't increase at the same value. The women start catching up. They have just as high blood pressure. When they get into their 70s, they actually have higher blood pressure. So that explains why it doesn't matter what it's lower blood pressure when they're younger, because when they get older, it's actually just as high, if not higher. So I'm going to create one more view here. And let's look at region, and then we'll look at age group. And I want to see, I have some business logic for what is a good blood pressure in the model. And I just want to see some status indicators for that. So here, for example, I can add the value of the blood pressure for these different regions. But since I have these nice KPIs, what I can do is I can add this status thing here as well. And now I get the status indicator as well. So, and unfortunately, it doesn't look too good. It's mostly yellow and red. But you can see for different regions and for different age groups, what the average blood pressure, whether it's good or bad, or what range it's in. So while we're talking about different regions of the United States, maybe I can grab this state name here. And again, notice it's got this little globe icon on it. If I check that, and then I go up to maybe count the number of visits for people from that state, count these chart IDs again. This is the only data I have. It's state name and the number of charts. I don't have any other geographic information in here. But if I just click map, I'm going to get a Bing map, and it's going to geocode those values. It's actually going to send the states to Bing, figure out where they are, get the lat and long, and plot them on the Bing map. And we're going to get the map tiles from Bing as well. And here, I can actually add an additional field. Let's say I want to split it up by gender. It does something pretty cool. It turns these into pie charts. So you've got the two different slices for men and women. So pretty cool stuff. I'm running a little bit over on time, but a couple more things I just wanted to show you. So one is, when I've created a workbook like this with all sorts of cool visualizations and I want to share it with my team, what do I do? It's as simple as I take this workbook and I save it to SharePoint. It could be SharePoint on-premise, in which case everything better be configured correctly by IT, or I can publish it to Office 365 and SharePoint Online. There are currently some limitations in SharePoint Online in terms of not being able to use external models quite yet, and your workbook having to be under a certain file size limit. But the functional capabilities are quite similar. So here, I'll just refresh this. I use IE10 as my main browser. I'm only using Chrome here to show that it renders cross-browser. So do not read more into that than there is. And So here we go. Here we got an Excel workbook in Excel web app in Office 365, and I still have the same interactivity. So I can click on this and get the cool cross-filtering and cross-highlighting. Okay. So one more thing, if I can just take a couple minutes to show you really quickly, is some of the modeling. So here, if I go and open up the model for this report, some of the places I set some of that metadata. So for example, for patients, I only had the patient's year of birth in the original data set. To have their age, I actually added a calculated column. So you can just go here and add a column and start typing in this. And what you type is a DAX expression. DAX is data analysis expressions. It's basically like a language that's an extension of Excel formulas. So here, a very simple expression. All I have is their year of birth, not their exact date of birth. So it's an approximate age, but that was good enough. That's a calculated column. A calculated field, which is confusingly named, but it's basically, it's not a column at all. If I go here, and I can say, you know, average this up. And what will happen is down here in the calculated fields area, you'll have just a named calculation. And then I can go and edit the formula for that. If I want to make that a KPI, I can just go over, for example, to here. I have a bunch of KPIs. And you just go over a calculated field and say create KPI. In this particular case, I've already created one. And you can see the sort of logic that you can define. You can give it a target. The target could be the value of another field, or it could just be an absolute value. And then you can set these ranges. And you can have different types of KPIs. So some things like more is better, right? Like sales, more is better. But something like weight, right? It's no good to be 50 pounds. It's no good to be 5,000 pounds. Probably there's a sweet spot somewhere in between those two. So yeah, there you go. That's a basic KPI. And another really important thing, just to wrap it up, would be here, if you looked at, like I mentioned, something like blood pressure, you know, it doesn't make sense to sum that up. It makes more sense to average it. Where you can find that, if you go to the Advanced tab here, you'll have a Summarize By option. And then you got different options for whether you want to sum it or count it or take the average in this case. Or there's an option for Do Not Summarize. So for age, I went in and said, do not summarize this. Because I was very often wanting to have age on the category axis of my chart. I wanted to use it as a dimension more than a measure. So with that, I'll switch back to my slides really quickly. Just to comment on the roadmap, I think I talked about the first three parts already. We shipped Power Pivot first as an add-in. In SQL Server 2012, we shipped Power View. We also added support for the tabular databases. In Office 2013, we shipped everything that I showed you today with Power View nicely built into Excel, and Power Pivot also built into Excel. And then just this month, with an update to Power View standalone, we closed the gap where you can now connect directly to multidimensional analysis services models. There's some other things that we're working on that I hope we'll be able to disclose a little bit later this year. But that's kind of where we've come so far and the thing that we just released here. So key things I want you to take away from this. Excel is really your one-stop client BI app from a Microsoft perspective for modeling, for analytics and visualization. Very often, our competitors will attack our BI strategy by saying, oh, Microsoft strategy is Excel. It's basically spreadsheets and spread marts. I mean, anybody at this point, especially after having seen this presentation, hopefully, who's thinking of Excel as a spreadsheet tool, that's a really, really out-of-touch look at Excel. You can see that Excel is a really rich client BI tool where you can build nice structured models, and you can build really cool data visualization apps. So workbooks are not just spreadsheets anymore, for sure. Now that we have Power View inside of Excel, the other interesting thing is, like I said, in some scenarios, if you're using the embedded data model, the thing is completely self-contained. You don't need SharePoint anymore or anything, or connectivity to SharePoint all the time. You can take this workbook offline and work with it. But the benefit of SharePoint is, of course, that you can publish this thing to the browser, and rather than email these things around, everybody can go to SharePoint, especially now with Office 365 that you don't even have to deploy and maintain the infrastructure yourself. Everybody can just put these up on their My Sites or put it in SharePoint Online and interact with these workbooks in the browser. Some related content that I'll point you to really quickly. Somebody on the AS team that I work with, Kai, has a session on self-service BI governance. So if any of this stuff scares you, from an IT perspective, go see his session. I have a session later on tips and tricks for building classic RS reports, so maybe similar to this, but with classic RS reports. I also have a session on how to deploy some of this stuff from the SharePoint side on-premise. Casper has a session from the AS team on using PowerView, the things we've seen today, with the multi-dimensional analysis services models. And Casper also has a session on how to create enterprise BI semantic models in Visual Studio. So I gave you a little glimpse of some of the modeling metadata that you can do in Power Pivot, but there's certainly a lot more advanced modeling that you can do. And if you're interested in that, I would go to Casper's session. So some resources. You guys will get the slides and get all the links to these different things. Please complete an evaluation. The scores are helpful. The comments are also helpful. We actually get them, we actually read them, and we try to incorporate the feedback. So if you want to leave a quick comment, that would be good. If you submit an evaluation, you can win a piece of video game memorabilia, a soon-to-be obsolete Xbox 360, and probably some other stuff. So that looks pretty cool. So it's worth doing. And you can scan this code to do your evaluation. And that is about it. So I'll wrap it up and take any questions for a few minutes. Yes, sir. Do we have any plans for a viewer control for ASP.NET, like the report viewer control for ASP.NET? It's not really a priority that I can say that we're working on right now. There is limited ability to embed PowerView reports inside of a web part using like an iframe or using the Silverlight web part, but it doesn't have all the rich programmability of the control. So not to say that we won't do the control, but it's not something we're working on right now. No. Other question? Yes. Is there a problem rendering PowerView on Apple devices? Depends what kind of Apple device we're talking about. If we're talking about an iPad, right? Yeah, Silverlight specifically. Yeah, so Silverlight is supported on Mac, like MacBooks in Safari. It is not supported on iPads. It's also not supported on Surface RT, on Windows RT. So this version of PowerView, like the one that I published in the browser, will not render on those devices. However, we are working on an HTML5 version of it that will render on those devices.
Okay, so right now there's no work.
Right now we have a preview that will work. We do not have a production version that will work.
Okay, yeah. One more question?
Yep.
How do you keep Excel version of PowerView in sync with the SharePoint PowerView rendering? So is SharePoint going to be backward compatible with earlier versions of PowerViews on Excel? And will Excel be forward compatible with future versions of SharePoint? You can't mix and match the versions.
Yeah, that's a great question. So backward and forward compatibility of PowerView content support between Excel on your desktop and that version and reporting services in SharePoint. So currently, not even specific to PowerView, but because of the data model integration and all that stuff, you cannot take an Excel 2013 workbook with a data model, put it in SharePoint 2010, and expect it to work. It won't. So they've both got to be upgraded to 2013 because this is a pretty major shift. Now, going forward, we want to see if we can have better support than we've had in the past with forward compatibility. So maybe your Excel desktop version is behind and your SharePoint version is newer, or vice versa, and that we can at least render the content, and maybe some one visual that's not supported in that version is unavailable or something.
So one of the problems is it's very hard to find information about exactly what's supported, what works, and exactly what doesn't work. So just as you roll out the new versions,
Yeah.
if you can beef up the compatibility matrix for support, it would be really helpful.
Okay, great. I'll take that feedback back. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, so can you layer your own custom shapes on top of the map control? Currently, no. There's not. PowerView is very much a kind of an app for end users, and there isn't a lot of programmability hooks or extensibility hooks in there today like there is with classic reporting services. So, but in terms of, so we'd like to get there eventually, but even in the nearer term, we'd like to be able to have more support for different type of mapping visualizations. So right now we have basically you can plot bubbles on a map. We'd like to be able to color the states of the United States or something like that. So, yeah, we don't have that today. Yeah. Yes?
Drag the graph onto a regular tab within the cell workbook, or do you
So native Excel charts and things and Power View charts and things are not cross-compatible. So Power View stuff goes on Power View sheets, and native pivot tables and things go on native Excel sheets, and you can't copy and paste or drag them across one to the other.
Okay. My related question would be, I noticed you were working, it looked kind of like a SharePoint slide is where you were working in. Can you resize a window?
You can't resize the canvas currently, no. It's a fixed size canvas, yeah. You had a question? No? Okay.
You mentioned Excel is a major tool. How about other tools like performance point or
Yeah, so I'm saying Excel is definitely our desktop BI tool as a self-service BI desktop tool. Something like Performance Point, the scenario there is more that a BI professional is creating a scorecard of some kind and then publishing that as a long-lasting dashboard when somebody goes to a SharePoint page. So it's a little bit of a different scenario. And in the same sense that, for example, creating a classic reporting services report is something that BI developers will continue to want to do in Visual Studio. So I'm not saying that Excel is the only tool, the only place where these things will surface. I'm just saying from a non-developer BI information worker perspective, Excel is the one tool that we want them to go to. Yeah. Yes? Sure. So I've just got to clear the stage here for the next speaker. So, but to answer your question quickly, is the tabular model preferred over the multidimensional model? Unless there is something that you need in the multidimensional model, then quite possibly. There's a lot that you can do in the tabular model, and there's, I guess, our focus is on that right now. But there's still some advanced, very advanced, developer things that you can only do with a multidimensional model. So if you need that, you can continue to use that. It's still supported. You do need for the on-premise version of Excel. You need Professional Plus Excel to get Power View. Yes. No, that's just a beta program that we have right now. Yeah. Excel 2000.